On my daughter's second wedding, she suddenly started screaming and crying desperately during the ceremony. When I asked why, she answered trembling, "Did you see who just walked into the church?" My blood froze when I saw him again. Wait, you're not dead? Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. The late afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Cathedral, casting colorful patterns across the mahogany pews filled with wedding guests. I adjusted my navy blue tie for the third time, feeling the familiar weight of being a single father watching his daughter get married. Again, Gianna looked radiant in her ivory silk dress, her dark hair swept up in an elegant bun that reminded me so much of her mother. At 35, she deserved this happiness. After everything she'd been through with David, after the pain and the financial ruin he'd left behind, seeing her smile genuinely again made my chest tight with emotion. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" whispered Margaret, my sister-in-law, from beside me in the front pew. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat felt thick watching Gianna walk down the aisle toward Marcus, her new husband. A good man, stable. Nothing like that monster David who had nearly destroyed her 8 years ago. The organ music swelled as Gianna reached the altar. Father Rodriguez began the ceremony with his familiar, comforting voice echoing through the cathedral. Everything was perfect, peaceful. Exactly what my daughter deserved after all the darkness she'd endured. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Gianna Marie Thompson and Marcus Daniel Rivers. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. The stress of planning this wedding, making sure everything was perfect, had kept me awake most nights. But now, seeing Gianna's face glowing with happiness, I knew it had all been worth it. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the cathedral creaked open. Nothing unusual about late arrivals at weddings, though the timing was unfortunate. A few heads turned, including mine, expecting to see perhaps Marcus's elderly aunt, who had been uncertain about making the trip from Portland. Instead, a tall figure in a dark suit stepped into the cathedral. The man paused in the doorway, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on the altar where Gianna stood. Something cold twisted in my stomach. The silhouette looked familiar, in a way that made my hands clench involuntarily. No, it couldn't be. My mind was playing tricks on me. Gianna's voice cut through the ceremony like a knife. No. She started backing away from the altar, her bouquet of white roses falling to the marble floor with a soft thud. Her face had gone completely pale, her eyes wide with terror as she stared toward the back of the church. "Gianna?" Marcus reached for her, confusion written across his face. "What's wrong?" But my daughter wasn't looking at her new husband. She was staring past all the guests, past the confused murmurs rippling through the cathedral, straight at the man who had just entered. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying in the sudden silence. "Dad, do you see him?" I followed her gaze and my blood turned to ice in my veins. The man stepped further into the cathedral, removing his sunglasses with deliberate slowness. The face that was revealed beneath made my world tilt sideways. Sharp cheekbones, deep-set brown eyes, the same crooked smile that had once charmed my daughter into marriage before destroying her life. David Hartwell, my daughter's first husband, the man who had stolen $80,000 from my late wife's inheritance and vanished without a trace. The man whose death certificate I had seen with my own eyes 8 years ago. "Oh my God," Gianna screamed, her voice echoing through the cathedral like a wounded animal. "You're supposed to be dead! You're dead!" The wedding guests erupted in confused murmurs. Some stood up to get a better look. Others pulled out their phones. Father Rodriguez stood frozen at the altar, his prayer book hanging limply in his hands. David's smile widened as he began walking down the aisle, his footsteps echoing against the stone floor. He moved with the same confident swagger I remembered, as if he belonged here, as if he had every right to destroy my daughter's wedding day the same way he had destroyed everything else in her life. "Hello, Gianna," he called out, his voice carrying easily through the cathedral. "I hope I'm not too late for the party." Marcus stepped protectively in front of Gianna, but she was shaking so violently I thought she might collapse. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps that reminded me of the panic attacks she'd suffered after David's disappearance. I stood up from my pew, my legs unsteady. The man I had mourned, the man whose funeral I had attended, the man whose grave I had stood over with my sobbing daughter, was walking toward us with that same arrogant expression he'd worn the last time I'd seen him alive. "This isn't possible," I heard myself say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "You're dead. We buried you." David's laugh was cold and familiar, sending chills down my spine. "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, Timothy." The cathedral descended into chaos. Guests were talking loudly now, some standing, some moving toward the exits. Father Rodriguez was trying to restore order, but his voice was lost in the commotion. All I could focus on was my daughter's face, the terror there. The way she clutched at Marcus's arm like she was drowning, the way her whole body trembled as she stared at the ghost from her past. David stopped about 10 feet from the altar, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that seemed almost casual. But his eyes never left Gianna's face, drinking in her fear like wine. "Surprised to see me, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock affection. "I've been looking forward to this reunion for a very long time." And in that moment, watching my daughter fall apart in her wedding dress, I knew our nightmare was just beginning all over again. The chaos in the cathedral continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Father Rodriguez finally managed to guide the stunned wedding party into the vestry, while the guests filed out in confused clusters, whispering and stealing glances back at David, who stood calmly in the aisle as if he owned the place. In the small vestry, Gianna sat in a wooden chair, still in her wedding dress, but clutching a glass of water with shaking hands. Marcus knelt beside her, holding her free hand and speaking in low, soothing tones. Her wedding makeup was streaked with tears, and she kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting David to walk through it at any moment. "How is this possible, Dad?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "We went to his funeral. We saw his body in the casket. I felt the familiar burn of old anger rising in my chest. David Hartwell had been 28 when he married my 19-year-old daughter, fresh out of college and naive about men like him. He'd swept her off her feet with expensive dinners and weekend trips, all funded by money he'd somehow convinced her to lend him from her trust fund. The trust fund my late wife Sarah had set up for Gianna before her death from cancer, when Gianna was just 16. $80,000 that was supposed to secure our daughter's future. Money that David had transferred into his own accounts within 3 months of their marriage, claiming he was investing it for their future together. "I don't know how he's alive," I said, my voice tight with barely controlled rage. "But the man we buried 8 years ago was supposedly David Hartwell, identified by his dental records after the car went over the bridge." Marcus looked between us, clearly trying to piece together a story he'd only heard fragments of before. "Are you absolutely certain it's him?" Gianna let out a bitter laugh that had no humor in it. "I was married to him for 2 years, Marcus. I know my ex-husband's face." The door to the vestry opened, and my heart hammered against my ribs. But it was only Father Rodriguez, his usually calm demeanor clearly shaken. "The man is asking to speak with you," he said quietly. "He says he has something important to tell you about the money." "No." The word came out harder than I intended. "Absolutely not. I don't care what he wants to say." But Gianna was already standing up, smoothing down her wedding dress with trembling hands. "I need to hear this, Dad. I need to understand how he's alive." "Gianna, you don't owe him anything," Marcus said, standing and putting a protective arm around her shoulders. "We can call the police. File a report." "For what?" I asked grimly. "Being alive. Unfortunately, that's not a crime." 20 minutes later, we were seated in Father Rodriguez's office, while David sat across from us like he was attending a casual business meeting. Up close, he looked different. Older, of course, but there were new lines around his eyes, a scar along his left temple that hadn't been there before. And his once thick dark hair was now streaked with premature gray. "You look good, Gianna," he said, his voice softer than it had been in the cathedral. "Marriage suits you, though I have to admit I was hoping to be invited to the wedding." "Cut the crap, David!" My voice came out as a low growl. "How are you alive? And why are you here?" David leaned back in his chair, studying his fingernails with the same calculated calm he'd always used to avoid difficult conversations. The car accident was real, Timothy. I was driving drunk, went off the Carson Bridge around 2 in the morning, but I wasn't alone in the car. Gianna's face went even paler. What do you mean you weren't alone? I had picked up a hitchhiker earlier that night. Young guy, probably early 20s, traveling cross-country with fake identification. When the car went into the river, he didn't make it out. David's voice remained unnaturally steady, as if he were discussing the weather. I managed to swim to shore, but I was hurt, badly. Fractured skull, broken ribs, internal bleeding. So you let them identify his body as yours, I said, the pieces falling into place. You let us bury a stranger while you disappeared with my wife's money. David shrugged, the gesture so familiar it made my stomach turn. I was facing embezzlement charges for my job at the accounting firm, Timothy. You knew that. The marriage to Gianna was falling apart, and I owed some very dangerous people a lot of money. The accident seemed like a gift from God. A gift from God? Gianna's voice was barely above a whisper, but I could hear the rage building beneath it. You let me think you were dead for 8 years. I grieved for you. I felt guilty about our last fight. I blame myself for your death, and you were alive the entire time. I never asked you to grieve, David replied, his tone still maddeningly calm. And you moved on pretty quickly, didn't you? New husband, new life. Seems like my death was convenient for you too. I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from launching myself across the room at him. The casual cruelty in his voice, the way he was trying to make Gianna feel guilty for rebuilding her life after his betrayal, was exactly the kind of psychological manipulation I remembered. Where's the money, David? I asked through gritted teeth. The $80,000 you stole from Sarah's inheritance for Gianna. For the first time, something flickered across David's face. It might have been regret, but with him, it was impossible to tell what was real and what was performance. Gone, he said simply. I spent it staying alive for the first few years. New identity, medical bills from the accident, trying to build a new life. But I always planned to pay it back, Timothy. That's why I'm here. 8 years later, Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice tight with disbelief. You show up at her wedding to pay back money you stole? David smiled, and there was something different about it. Something that looked almost like genuine remorse. I know how this looks. I know you have every reason to hate me, but I've changed, Gianna. The accident, the years in hiding, watching from a distance as you rebuilt your life, it gave me perspective. Watching from a distance? Gianna's voice cracked. You were watching me. I kept track of you through social media, through mutual friends. I saw you graduate from nursing school. I saw you start working at the children's hospital. I saw you meet Marcus. David's voice softened slightly. I saw you become the woman I always knew you could be, and I realized what a fool I'd been to walk away from that. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Gianna's shaky breathing. I watched her face carefully, seeing the war between hope and suspicion playing out in her expressions. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of, that David's silver tongue would start working on her again, just like it had when she was 19 and vulnerable. I don't expect forgiveness, David continued, leaning forward slightly. I don't deserve it, but I want to make things right. The money, the pain I caused, all of it. I have a proposal for you both. And despite every instinct screaming at me to get up and walk away, despite 8 years of hatred and the image of my daughter sobbing at David's fake funeral, I found myself asking, what kind of proposal? 3 days after the wedding disaster, David showed up at my front door carrying a manila envelope and wearing what I could only describe as a penitent expression. I'd been expecting him, though I'd hoped he would have the decency to stay away after the chaos he'd caused at the cathedral. Gianna had spent those 3 days alternating between crying and staring blankly at the wall of her apartment. Marcus had been patient, but I could see the strain in his eyes. Their honeymoon to Hawaii had been canceled, the non-refundable deposits adding insult to injury. My daughter's second chance at happiness had been shattered by a ghost from her past, and I was struggling to contain my rage. "Hello, Timothy," David said, when I opened the door. He looked different than he had at the church, humbler somehow, with his shoulders slightly stooped and his expensive suit replaced by simple khakis. and a polo shirt. I know you probably don't want to see me, but I have something important to show you. Then show me and leave, I said, not moving from the doorway. David held up the manila envelope, medical records, from the accident 8 years ago. I thought you and Gianna deserved to see them. Against my better judgment, I let him inside. My living room suddenly felt smaller with his presence in it, contaminated by memories of all the times he'd sat on that same couch, charming Sarah and me while secretly planning to rob us blind. He opened the envelope and spread several documents across my coffee table. Hospital records from St. Joseph's Medical Center in Sacramento, dated 8 years ago. X-rays showing a fractured skull and broken ribs. Doctor's notes describing severe head trauma and temporary amnesia. The papers looked official, complete with hospital letterheads and doctor signatures. I was in a coma for 6 weeks, David said quietly, sitting on the edge of my couch like he was afraid to make himself too comfortable. When I woke up, I couldn't remember my own name, let alone yours or Gianna's. The doctors said the head injury had caused selective memory loss. I studied the medical records, looking for any sign they were forged. But everything appeared legitimate. Dates, doctor names, even the hospital billing information. Even if this is true, it doesn't explain why you didn't come forward when your memory returned. David ran his hand through his graying hair. And for the first time since I'd known him, the gesture seemed genuine rather than calculated. Because by the time I remembered who I was, I realized how much damage I'd already caused. Gianna had grieved for me, buried me, and started moving on. I thought she was better off without me. She was better off without you, I said flatly. She still is. You're right, David said, surprising me. She is better off without me, but she's not better off without her mother's money, the money I stole from her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. When he unfolded it, I saw it was a cashier's check made out to Gianna Marie Rivers for $100,000. My breath caught in my throat. What is this? The inheritance money plus interest and compensation for the pain I caused. David's voice was steady, but I could see his hands trembling slightly as he held the check. I know it doesn't undo the damage, but it's a start. I stared at the check, my mind racing. $100,000, $20,000 more than what he'd stolen. Where had David gotten that kind of money, and why was he giving it back now? I don't understand, I said slowly. If you've had this money, why wait until now to return it? David stood up and walked to my living room window, looking out at the street where he used to live when he was married to Gianna. Because I was a coward, Timothy. I spent 8 years building a new life, a successful business, trying to become the man I should have been when I was married to your daughter. But every success felt hollow because I knew it was built on the foundation of what I'd stolen from her. He turned back to face me, and I was startled to see tears in his eyes. In all the years I'd known David Hartwell, I'd never seen him cry. Not when Sarah died, not when he and Gianna fought, not even when he was caught stealing from us. But now his face was etched with what looked like genuine remorse. I started a consulting business in Phoenix, he continued. Security systems for small businesses. It took off faster than I expected, and by year 5, I was making more money than I'd ever imagined. But every night, I went to bed thinking about Gianna, about the trust fund I'd stolen, about the future I'd taken away from her. So you decided to play dead for 8 years and then show up at her wedding? I couldn't keep the sarcasm out of my voice. I hired a private investigator to keep tabs on her, David admitted, not in a stalking way, just to make sure she was okay. When I found out she was getting married, I knew it was time to make things right. She deserves to start her new life without the shadow of what I did hanging over her. I picked up the check again, studying it more carefully. It was from Wells Fargo, issued that morning. The amount was written in David's familiar handwriting, though it looked more careful and deliberate than I remembered. Even if this check is real, I said, it doesn't erase what you did. You destroyed Gianna's faith in marriage, in love, in trusting other people. You can't write a check to fix that kind of damage. I know, David said quietly, but I have to try. Timothy, I'm not the same man who ran away 8 years ago. The accident, the memory loss, the years of building something legitimate, it changed me. I want to prove that to you and to Gianna. How? David sat back down, leaning forward with his hands clasped together. Let me show you. Let me be part of making things right. Not just with money, but with actions. I know Marcus had to cancel their honeymoon because of the wedding disaster I caused. Let me pay for them to have the trip they deserve. Let me help repair the damage I've done. I wanted to say no. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to throw David out of my house and tear up the check. But $100,000 was life-changing money for Gianna and Marcus. It could pay off their student loans, help with a down payment on a house, secure their future in a way that my modest retirement savings never could. I need to talk to Gianna, I said finally. Of course, I wouldn't expect you to make this decision without her. David stood up, leaving the check and medical records on my coffee table. But Timothy, I want you to know something else. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking to be part of her life again. I just want to do what's right before I disappear for good. After David left, I sat staring at that check for a long time. Part of me wanted to believe him. The medical records looked authentic, his remorse seemed genuine, and the money was real. But another part of me remembered the David Hartwell I'd known before, the charming manipulator who could make you believe anything he wanted you to believe. I called Gianna and asked her to come over. When she saw the check and the medical records, her reaction was exactly what I'd expected, a mixture of shock, hope, and deep suspicion. $100,000, she said, holding the check with both hands like it might disappear. Dad, this could change everything for Marcus and me. Or it could be another one of his schemes, I said carefully. Gianna, I need you to think about this rationally. Does any of this make sense to you? The timing, the money, the sudden attack of conscience? She sat quietly for a long time, studying the medical records. Finally, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. What if he's telling the truth, Dad? What if the accident really did change him? What if he really has spent 8 years feeling guilty about what he did? And what if he hasn't? I countered. What if this is just another con, another way for him to manipulate you? Then I lose nothing, Gianna said firmly. This check pays me back what he stole plus interest. If he disappears again after this, at least I'll have Mom's inheritance back. I wanted to argue with her, but I could see her mind was made up. And truthfully, I was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, David really had changed. The medical records were convincing. The money was real. And his demeanor was completely different from the arrogant man I'd known before. Okay, I said finally. We'll deposit the check, but I want to meet with him again. I want to hear more about this business he claims to have built, this new life he's supposedly created. Gianna nodded, folding the check carefully and putting it in her purse. Thank you, Dad, for being willing to listen to him even after everything. As I watched my daughter leave that evening, a part of me hoped David's redemption story was real. But a bigger part of me couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into another trap. And this time, the stakes were even higher than before. The check cleared. $100,000 deposited into Gianna and Marcus's joint savings account without any issues. For the first time in 8 years, my daughter had access to her mother's inheritance money, with interest. The relief in her eyes when she called to tell me was almost enough to make me believe David's redemption story was genuine. Over the next 2 weeks, David proved to be a man of his word in ways that continued to surprise me. He not only paid for Gianna and Marcus to take their delayed honeymoon to Hawaii, first-class flights, oceanfront suite, the works, but he also insisted on covering the costs for all the wedding vendors who had been disrupted by his dramatic appearance at the cathedral. I spoke to the photographer, the caterer, and the florist, David told me, when he stopped by my house with receipts. Everyone's been compensated for the inconvenience I caused. The photographer even gave Gianna digital copies of all the pictures that were taken before the ceremony was interrupted. I studied the receipts he'd spread across my kitchen table. Nearly $15,000 in additional expenses, all paid without complaint. Either David had become genuinely wealthy through his security consulting business, or this was the most elaborate con I'd ever witnessed. You didn't have to do all this, I said, though I was impressed despite myself. Yes, I did, David replied firmly. Timothy, I need you to understand something. The man who stole from your family 8 years ago was a selfish child who thought the world owed him something. The accident forced me to grow up in ways I'd never had to before. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos of what appeared to be a successful business. A modern office building with Hartwell Security Solutions emblazoned on the front. Employees in professional attire, awards on office walls. "This is in Phoenix?" I asked, scrolling through the images. "Started it 4 years ago with a loan from a friend who believed in me," David said. "We specialize in security systems for small to medium businesses. Last year we did $3.2 million in revenue." The numbers were impressive and the photos looked legitimate, but something still nagged at me about the whole situation. Maybe it was just old prejudices, or maybe it was the way David seemed almost too perfect in his contrition. "Have you told Gianna about your business?" I asked. "We've talked a few times while she and Marcus were in Hawaii. She seems genuinely happy that I've turned my life around." David pocketed his phone and leaned back in his chair. "Timothy, I know you're still suspicious of me. You have every right to be. But I'm hoping that, over time, my actions will prove that I've changed." "And then what?" I asked. "What's your end game here, David? You said you wanted to make things right, and then disappear. Are you planning to be a part of Gianna's life going forward?" David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "That's up to her," he said finally. "I'm not asking for a place in her life. I just want her to know that the man who hurt her is gone. The man sitting here now would never do what he did to her." When Gianna and Marcus returned from Hawaii, they looked like a couple who had finally been able to start their marriage properly. The tension that had been in Gianna's shoulders for weeks was gone, replaced by the relaxed happiness of someone who'd had time to process and heal. "Dad, the trip was incredible," she told me over dinner at their apartment. "But more than that, I feel like I finally have closure. David and I talked several times while we were there, and I think he really has changed." Marcus nodded, though I noticed he looked less convinced than his wife. "He's been nothing but respectful and generous since the wedding. I have to admit, it's not what I expected from the stories Gianna told me about him." "What kind of things did you talk about?" I asked Gianna. "Everything," she said, her eyes lighting up in a way that made me slightly nervous. The accident, his memory loss, the business he built, why he decided to come back now. He even apologized for things I'd forgotten about, small cruelties from when we were married that I'd pushed out of my mind. "And you believe him?" I asked carefully. Gianna was quiet for a moment, absently twirling her wedding ring around her finger. "I want to believe him, Dad. And honestly, what reason would he have to lie now? He gave me back more money than he stole. He paid for our honeymoon. He's made no demands on my time or attention. If this is a con, it's the most expensive and pointless one I've ever heard of." Marcus reached over and took his wife's hand. "The important thing is that we can finally move forward. Whatever David's motivations are, we have the financial security we need to build our life together." That weekend, David invited all three of us to dinner at Romano's, the most expensive restaurant in town. He looked prosperous in his tailored suit, confident but not arrogant, and he picked up the $300 tab without even glancing at it. "I have some news," he announced over dessert. "I'm thinking about opening a branch of my security business here in town. Phoenix has been good to me, but I miss California. I miss being close to the people I care about." Gianna's face lit up. "Really? You'd move back here?" "I'm considering it," David said carefully. "But only if you're comfortable with that, Gianna. The last thing I want is to complicate your life or your marriage." I watched this exchange with growing unease. Despite all of David's apparent generosity and contrition, something felt off about the whole situation. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at Marcus when he thought no one was looking, as if he were studying him. Maybe it was how quickly Gianna seemed to be warming up to the idea of having her supposedly reformed ex-husband nearby. "What would this branch office focus on?" Marcus asked, and I was glad someone was asking practical questions. "Same as Phoenix, security systems for small businesses. But I'm also thinking about expanding into residential security. There's a real market for high-end home security systems in the nicer neighborhoods around here." David pulled out his tablet and showed us market research, competitor analysis, projected revenue figures. Everything looked professional and well-planned. Either David had become a legitimately successful businessman, or he'd invested serious time and money into creating an incredibly convincing fake identity. "I'd need some initial capital to get started," David continued. "Office space, equipment, hiring local technicians. I'm looking at about a $200,000 investment to do it right." And there it was, the ask I'd been waiting for. "That's a significant amount," Marcus said carefully. "Oh, I'm not asking you for money," David said quickly, holding up his hands. "I have investors in Phoenix who are interested in expanding. I was actually thinking about asking you for something else." "What's that?" Gianna asked. "Your blessing," David said simply. "I know how strange this must seem, wanting to move back to the same town as my ex-wife and her new husband. But Gianna, you were the most important person in my life once, and I'd like the chance to prove that I can be a positive presence instead of a destructive one." Gianna looked at Marcus, who squeezed her hand and nodded slightly. "I think that would be okay," she said softly. "As long as you understand that Marcus is my husband now, and that comes first." "Of course," David said, his smile genuine and warm. "I'm not trying to reclaim the past, Gianna. I just want to be part of building a better future." As we left the restaurant that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being expertly manipulated. But the evidence of David's transformation was mounting. The money was real, his business appeared legitimate, and his behavior had been nothing but respectful and generous. Maybe I was just a cynical old man who couldn't believe that people were capable of real change. Maybe David Hartwell really had become a different person, and I was letting old grudges blind me to that possibility. But as I watched him hug Gianna goodbye in the parking lot, a brief, appropriate embrace that nonetheless made my stomach clench, I couldn't help wondering what David's real endgame was. Because in my experience, men like David Hartwell didn't change. They just got better at hiding who they really were. The first red flag should have been how quickly David found the perfect office space downtown. Within 2 weeks of our dinner at Romano's, he'd signed a lease on a beautiful ground-floor suite in the Meridian building, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows and enough space for what he claimed would be a team of 12 employees. "The timing was incredible," he told Gianna and Marcus during one of their weekly coffee meetings that had somehow become routine. The previous tenant had just broken their lease, so the landlord was motivated to make a deal. I wasn't invited to these coffee meetings, which bothered me more than I cared to admit. Gianna assured me they were just casual conversations about David's business plans and his adjustment to being back in town, but something about their frequency made me uneasy. "He's really changed, Dad," Gianna told me after one of these meetings. "You should see how excited he gets talking about the business. It's like he's found his true calling." "What exactly does he need from Marcus?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Just advice, really. Marcus has experience with small business banking, and David wants to make sure he's setting up his accounts correctly for the new branch." Gianna paused, then added, "He's also mentioned maybe hiring Marcus as a consultant for the financial side of things." That made my blood run cold. "Gianna, please tell me Marcus isn't considering leaving his job at the bank." "Of course not," she said, but there was something in her voice that suggested the idea had at least been discussed. It would just be part-time consulting work, extra income for us. Over the next month, David's presence in their lives became increasingly prominent. He helped Marcus navigate some complex business loan applications for other clients at the bank. He took Gianna and Marcus to expensive dinners to celebrate various business milestones. He even showed up at Marcus's company softball game, cheering from the stands, like an old family friend. The transformation was remarkable to witness. David had somehow inserted himself into their social circle without seeming pushy or inappropriate. He was always respectful of their marriage, never overstepping boundaries, and incredibly generous with both his time and money. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching a master manipulator at work. My suspicions crystallized into something more concrete when I decided to do some investigating of my own. I hired a private investigator, something I probably should have done weeks earlier, to verify David's claims about his business in Phoenix. What Jennifer Morrison found made my blood run cold. There is a Hartwell Security Solutions in Phoenix, she told me over the phone 3 days later. But it's not what your son-in-law described. It's a single-person operation run out of a strip mall office. The owner is David Hartwell, but the business license was only filed 18 months ago, not 4 years ago like he claimed. What about the revenue figures he showed me? I asked. I couldn't get exact numbers, but based on the size of the operation and the types of contracts they appear to handle, I'd estimate annual revenue at maybe $50,000. Certainly not the $3.2 million he claimed. Jennifer's report got worse from there. The office building David had shown me in the photos belonged to a completely different security company. The awards on the wall were stock images he'd downloaded from the internet. Even the employees in the photos appeared to be models from a corporate photography website. Mr. Thompson, Jennifer said carefully, I think your former son-in-law has been planning this con for a very long time. Everything he's shown you has been carefully constructed to support a false narrative. But the money, I said weakly, he gave Gianna $100,000. That was real. Yes, and that's the most troubling part. Someone planning a con this elaborate, who is willing to invest that much upfront money, is after a much bigger prize. I hung up the phone with shaking hands, my mind racing through the implications. If David was running a con, what was his endgame? What could he possibly be after that would justify investing $100,000 plus months of careful manipulation? The answer came to me 2 days later when Gianna called, excitement bubbling in her voice. Dad, you're not going to believe the opportunity David just presented to us, she said. He's been selected to bid on a huge contract with the county, a complete security overhaul for all the municipal buildings. The contract is worth $2.8 million over 5 years. My heart sank. That's wonderful, sweetheart. What does that have to do with you and Marcus? Well, to bid on a contract that size, he needs to show significant liquid assets. The county requires proof that contractors can cover the upfront costs of equipment and installation before they receive their first payment. Gianna paused, and I could practically hear her smiling through the phone. David asked if we'd be willing to temporarily show his money and our savings as combined assets. It would just be on paper and only until he wins the contract and receives the first payment. How much money are we talking about? I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. Our savings plus the inheritance money he returned comes to about $150,000. David would add another $200,000 from his Phoenix accounts, which would give him the $350,000 in liquid assets the county requires. I closed my eyes, feeling sick to my stomach. Gianna, please tell me you haven't agreed to this yet. Well, Marcus is a little nervous about it, but David explained that we'd never actually be at risk. The money would just sit in a joint escrow account that all 3 parties would have to sign to access. And David offered to pay us $20,000 just for the use of our financial statement for 60 days. $20,000 for 60 days, I repeated slowly. I know it sounds too good to be true, but Dad, this could set us up for life. Marcus could leave the bank and work full-time with David's company. We could afford to buy a house, start a family. Remorse. Gianna's voice trailed off, and I could hear the hope in it. Sweetheart, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Don't sign anything. Don't transfer any money. Don't make any commitments to David until we can talk in person. Dad, you're scaring me. What's wrong? I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to tell her would shatter the fragile peace she'd found over the past 2 months. I had David investigated, Gianna. His business in Phoenix, his claims about revenue, his supposed success. Most of it is lies. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I wondered if she'd hung up. That can't be true, she finally whispered. He showed us documentation, photos, financial records. All fabricated, I said gently. Gianna, I think David has been planning this con since the day he showed up at your wedding. The $100,000 he gave you was bait to gain your trust. Now he's trying to get access to a much larger amount. I could hear her starting to cry, soft sobs that broke my heart. But the escrow account, she said through her tears. He said the money would be protected. Sweetheart, if David has access to that account, your money will disappear the moment you sign those papers. And this time, he really will be dead to us. along with your life savings. The next few hours were among the longest of my life. I drove to Gianna and Marcus's apartment, where I found them sitting at their kitchen table with stacks of official-looking documents spread between them. David had clearly been busy preparing for his final play. Marcus looked up when I walked in, his face pale and confused. "Timothy, Gianna told me what you found out about David's business, but look at these contracts. Everything appears legitimate. County letterhead, official seals, even a contact number for the procurement officer." I examined the documents while Gianna sat silently beside her husband, tears still streaming down her face. The contracts were impressive forgeries, complete with legal language and what appeared to be genuine government signatures. "Did you call the county to verify this procurement officer exists?" I asked. Marcus shook his head. David said the bidding process was confidential until the contracts were awarded. He warned us not to contact anyone at the county directly. Of course he did. I pulled out my phone and called the county clerk's office, putting the call on speaker so Gianna and Marcus could hear. "I'm calling to verify a procurement contract for municipal building security," I told the clerk, who answered. "Sir, we don't have any active bids for security services," the woman replied. "Our current security contract doesn't expire for another 3 years." The color drained from Marcus's face. Gianna let out a strangled sob and buried her face in her hands. "There's no contract," I said softly, hanging up the phone. "There never was. David created all of this to steal your money." That's when we heard the key turning in the front door lock, the spare key Gianna had given David weeks earlier so he could water their plants while they were out of town. David walked into the apartment with his usual confident stride, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the kind of smile that had once charmed my daughter into marriage. The smile faltered when he saw the three of us sitting around the kitchen table with his forged contracts spread between us and my phone still in my hand from the call to the county clerk. "You're early," he said to me, his voice carefully neutral. "I wasn't expecting you tonight, Timothy." "I bet you weren't," I replied, standing up slowly. At 65, I wasn't as physically imposing as I'd once been, but the rage burning in my chest made me feel 10 feet tall. "We just had the most interesting conversation with the county clerk's office." David's eyes flicked to the contracts on the table, then to Gianna's tear-streaked face, then to Marcus, who was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had turned white. I watched his mind calculate the situation, looking for an angle, an explanation, some way to salvage his con. "I can't explain," he said, setting the champagne bottle down on the counter with deliberate calm. "The county clerk probably doesn't have access to the confidential procurement information. These contracts go through a different department." "No, David," Gianna said, her voice broken but steady. "Dad had you investigated. Your business in Phoenix, the revenue figures, the photos you showed us, it's all fake, isn't it?" For a moment, David's mask slipped completely. The charming, repentant man who had been courting their trust for 2 months disappeared, replaced by the cold manipulator I remembered from 8 years ago. His mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Investigated me?" He turned to me, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "You couldn't just let it go, could you, Timothy? Your daughter was happy. She had her money back, her honeymoon, a chance at a real future. But you had to keep digging." "I had to protect my family," I said evenly, "something I should have done better 8 years ago." David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Protect your family? From what? From me giving Gianna more money than I ever took? From me paying for her wedding expenses and her honeymoon? From me offering her husband a legitimate business opportunity?" "Legitimate?" Marcus finally spoke, his voice tight with anger. "There's no county contract, is there? No procurement bid? No $2.8 million deal?" David studied Marcus for a long moment, then shrugged with the casualness of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You're right. There's no county contract." Gianna let out a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. "Why, David? Why did you come back? Why did you give me the money just to try to steal it back?" "Because 100,000 was never the prize, sweetheart," David said, and there was genuine affection in his voice that made my skin crawl. "It was the investment. I needed to prove I'd change, needed you to trust me again. And it worked, didn't it? You were ready to put your entire life savings into an escrow account with my name on it. But the medical records, Gianna whispered. The accident, the amnesia, the coma, all real, David said. I really was in an accident, and I really did have memory problems for a while, but I remembered who I was within 6 months, not 6 years. The rest of the time, I spent learning how to be a better con artist. The casual cruelty of his admission hit Gianna like a physical blow. She doubled over in her chair, sobbing so hard I thought she might hyperventilate. Marcus put his arm around her, but his attention never left David. You gave her back more than you stole, Marcus said, clearly trying to understand. If you were planning to steal our savings, why give back more money than you'd taken? David's smile was genuinely appreciative, as if he were pleased someone was asking the right questions. Because I wasn't just after your savings, Marcus. I was after everything. Your savings, Gianna's inheritance, your retirement accounts, even the equity in this apartment. With access to your financial records through the escrow arrangement, I could have cleaned out every account you had. We're talking about $400,000, maybe $500,000 total. The scope of what David had been planning made my head spin. He hadn't just been trying to steal their money, he'd been positioning himself to financially destroy them completely. The private investigator I hired found something else interesting, I said, my voice cutting through the tension in the room. You've done this before, haven't you? Phoenix wasn't your first stop after the accident. David's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't deny it. What did she find? Denver. A widow named Patricia Morrison, who lost her husband in a construction accident. You convinced her you were a grief counselor who had helped other widows invest their insurance settlements. She trusted you with $300,000. Patricia was a sweet woman, David said, without a trace of remorse. I hope she's doing well. She killed herself 6 months after you disappeared with her money, I said quietly. For the first time since he'd walked into the apartment, David looked genuinely surprised. The color drained from his face, and he took a small step backward. I never intended for anyone to get hurt, he said, his voice losing some of its confidence. But they did get hurt, Gianna said, lifting her head to look at her ex-husband. I got hurt. Patricia Morrison got hurt. How many others were there, David? David didn't answer, but something in his expression told me there had been others, maybe many others. What happens now? Marcus asked, looking between David and me. Do we call the police? With what evidence? David recovered some of his composure. I gave Gianna money, not took it. I offered you a business opportunity that you never accepted. I haven't actually committed any crimes here. He was right, and we all knew it. The forged contracts were good enough to fool most people, but David could claim they were drafts or proposals. The fake business records were on his own devices, not something he'd officially submitted anywhere. Legally, he was protected because his latest con had been interrupted before he could complete it. But I have committed crimes elsewhere, David continued, surprising us. And Patricia Morrison isn't the only victim who suffered permanent consequences from my actions. Of course. I stared at him, not understanding where he was going with this admission. The guilt has been eating at me for years, David said, his voice taking on a strange, distant quality. Every success I had, every dollar I made legitimately, felt hollow because I knew what I'd done to people who trusted me. Coming back here, seeing Gianna happy and settled, it made me realize I couldn't keep running. He walked to the kitchen counter and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen several times before setting it down facing us. The display showed a call in progress to 911. My name is David James Hartwell, he said clearly into the phone. I'm calling to turn myself in for multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement across several states. I'm currently at... He gave Gianna's address, then hung up and looked at us with something that might have been relief in his eyes. They'll be here in a few minutes, he said. Gianna, I need you to know that everything I told you about changing, about wanting to make amends, that part was real. I just wasn't strong enough to do it the right way. The police arrived 12 minutes later. 2 uniformed officers who looked skeptical until David calmly confessed to running cons in 4 different states over the past 7 years, including specific details about amounts stolen and false identities used. He provided them with documentation he'd kept on his phone, almost as if he'd been preparing for this moment. As they handcuffed him, David looked at Gianna one last time. "The $100,000 I gave you is clean money," he said. "I earned it legitimately in Phoenix. Consider it my way of finally paying the debt I owed your mother's memory." After David was taken away, the three of us sat in stunned silence for a long time. The apartment felt different somehow, as if a weight I hadn't realized was pressing down on us had finally been lifted. "Is it over?" Gianna asked quietly. "It's over," I said, putting my arm around her shoulders. "This time, it's really over." 6 months later, David pled guilty to multiple fraud charges and was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The case made local news, and we learned that there had been 11 other victims across 4 states, with total losses exceeding $2 million. Gianna used part of the money David had returned to her to start a victim advocacy program at the district attorney's office, helping other people who had been targeted by financial predators. She said it helped her feel like something positive had come from her experience. Marcus never did leave his job at the bank, but he did take on additional responsibilities in their fraud prevention department. He became something of a local expert on investment scams and romance cons, speaking at community centers and senior centers about warning signs to watch for. As for me, I learned that sometimes the best way to protect your family isn't to shield them from the truth, but to help them see it clearly. David's final con had been interrupted, not because I'd been particularly clever, but because I'd finally trusted my instincts instead of hoping for the best. The spare key David had used to let himself into their apartment that night now hangs on a hook by my front door, a reminder that some people will always find ways to access your life if you let them. But it's also a reminder that families who trust each other, who communicate openly and honestly, are much harder targets for the predators of the world. Gianna kept the $100,000 David had given her, but she never spent it on herself. Instead, she put it in a trust fund for the children she and Marcus hope to have someday. Children who will never have to wonder if their grandfather was watching out for them, because they'll know he always was.